Hello, it is my honor and delight to introduce Dr. David B. Levy in his lecture entitled Halachic Aspects of the Dead Sea Scrolls Relating to Purities. After a brief introduction of textual collections found in the ancient Near East, we move to two significant textual collections found in the last 2 millennia, namely the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Cairo Geniza. Regarding the Dead Sea Scrolls, Dr. Levy will address halachic texts, including those relating to the para aduma versus Tul Yom controversy with the Pharisees, and animal bones which the Dead Sea Scrolls thought carry impurities, the status of a nisak, or connecting stream of liquid, immersion of the menorah, and the status of oils and impurities. Dr. Levy will be comparing the halachot of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the above topics with that of the Pharisees or rabbis. I would like just to note that part of this lecture was given at the Cleveland Conference of the Association of Jewish Libraries in 2008. I hope you enjoy the lecture.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Weisblum, for the invitation to offer another shir lecture on your YouTube station, which I'm most gracious for the invitation. And Alita Portnoy, thank you for that wonderful, succinct introduction. Tonight we are going to be discussing some halachic aspects of the Dead Sea Scrolls when it relates to purities. But before we do, we're going to give a brief introduction of why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for many reasons, are important. One of which is the oldest biblical manuscripts known to the scholarly world for many, many millennia were the Leningrad Codex, the Vatican Recension, and the Aleppo Codex. And those were texts roughly from the 10th century CE. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are a Second Temple sect. And we have a treasure trove from various caves near Qumran in the desert near En Gedi, where the Essenes lived. That's the reigning thesis. Dr. Shipman holds they were disgruntled Sadukim, but Rabbi Baumgarten, my teacher, holds that they were Essenes. And tonight we're going to be looking at particularly some halakhic aspects of the sect, the Essenes, when compared with the Mishnah, primarily of the rabbis, the Pharisees. And we're going to be looking at the par aduma, the nisik, a stream of liquid, immersion of the menorah, and oils. But before we get there, archaeologists have always been ecstatic about finding textual collections. So one of the wonderful things about the graduate program I was in for Jewish studies was you could explore different areas of Jewish studies, ancient Near Eastern studies, Jewish history, Jewish philosophy, Jewish sociology, aspects of Hebrew language and other languages the Jews have used throughout the host cultures, and many areas such as politics of Israel. And so I had some exposure to ancient Near Eastern studies at Hopkins and at my alma mater, and I gained an appreciation for textual collections that were discovered in antiquity. We're talking about really early on, like Egyptian texts, the creation of Atum, and the story of two brothers, which relates to the Joseph Potiphar episodes. The story of two brothers is about a seduction as Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph. There's differences make all the difference. There are Sumerian texts. The Gilgamesh tablet number 11 relates to the flood account in Noah in Genesis. All of these texts are brought down, and many more, by James Pritchard in a multi-volume set where he compares biblical situations and case law and episodes to these ancient Near Eastern texts. So you have also the Sumerian text Enki and the Nin Harsag in Paradise Tale. And then you have many Akkadian myths, the legend of Sargon. Sargon, by the way, is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. See Harry Orlinsky in his biblical inscriptions that are in world history of the ancient times. By the way, the word archaea is an Akkadian word for copper-beaten dome. So you see how it gets into the first chapter of Genesis, that Hashem put some sort of dome on a copula on the earth. But we understand that in more sophisticated ways as the firmament. There are Hittite texts, the moon that fell from heaven. The Hittites worshiped the moon. Did you know the word Jericho comes from the word moon? That might have been before Yeshua came in there and circled the walls 7 times and blew the trumpets and was able to conquer the city, a place of moon worship. That's why it's called Jericho. Ugaritic texts, poems about Baal and Anat. Remember, Elijah attacks the Baal prophets on Har Carmel. And there are legal texts, the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi parallels the Pentateuchal case laws. For instance, the case of a goring ox in Shemot 21, the sharecropping issue in Leviticus, adultery in Deuteronomy 22, verse 22, 2 men fight and cause a miscarriage in Exodus 21. Now, we have legal texts of the Code of Hammurabi about kidnapping and abduction. Exodus 21, verse 16, and Deuteronomy 24:7. So all of these texts in the Pentateuchal law, case law, have analogs, if you will, according to James Pritchard, in other ancient Near Eastern textual collections. Now, as a librarian, I'm interested in textual collections in antiquity. I published on that, I think, in the San Diego conference. For instance, the Enuma Elish is a polytheistic creation tale, and Pritchard brings that down in his ancient Near Eastern texts relating to the Old Testament, published by Princeton University Press. I think Rabbi Moshe Shuali of his Emunah congregation, actually in his study of the Mamadot, which was his doctoral dissertation at Dropsy College under Solomon Zeitlin and Ben Zion Boxer and others, actually looks very in detail at the Enuma Elish as a polytheistic creation, that the differences make all the difference when comparing, like, the testimony of Breshit and Yesh Mi'ayin. Now, libraries in the ancient Near East, as I'm a librarian, included Ur, the birthplace of Avraham Avinu. Archaeologists have found in Ur, the birthplace of Avraham, cuneiform. Now, what is cuneiform? Cuneiform is wedge-shaped writing, they look like little triangles. These tablets are dating from 2100 to 2100 BCE, and they're classified by topics and stored in clay boxes called sadupu that are on the walls of this archive. You can learn more about that by Shmuel Noel Kramer, about the Sumerians, and another book that's very good they wrote on clay. The Egyptian archives are very important. I could say much more about that. See my outline on ancient Near Eastern texts, but we have the Beni Hassan tomb, which shows a Ketunet Pasim, the striped coat that was the fashion or mode that Joseph was given as a symbol of favoritism by his father, Yaakov Avinu. So there are many other discoveries in Egypt that are very important textual collections. That's why I'm mentioning this, because the Dead Sea Scrolls are Second Temple textual collections, probably the most important archaeological find in the 20th century. But in ancient Near Eastern studies, you have many textual collections, probably not as robust as the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they are very important. The Mari archive in Syria is an archive excavated at Mari in Syria, where clay tablets written in the Babylonian language were uncovered in the place of King Zimmerlin. The Mari documents describe some parallel situations to the, quote, Hebrew Bible, the suzerain-vassal treaty relationship, which can be compared in stipulation structure to the Aseret Dibrot, the primogeniture of the eldest son receiving a double portion, and 3, the custom of offering one's female handmaid as a surrogate mother if the main wife of the patriarch appears to be barren. And then in Ashur, in Assyria, the archaeologists at the ancient capital in Ashur have uncovered tablets from over 50 archives. One of the archives was founded by Tiglath-Pileser, who dates from around the period of the King David, the Hebrew king chosen by Shmuel, who made Jerusalem the capital in 1000 BCE, who is mentioned in an inscription from Tel Dan. Well, Tiglath-Pileser III of Nimrod is mentioned in 2 Kings 1529, so that's a later period after Shmuel, Aleph, and Bet. dating from the period of Isaiah, about 800 BCE. Isaiah lived during the reign of, I think, 4 or 5 kings. Other kings of the ancient Israel in the Bible, such as Omri and Ahav, are also mentioned in textual inscriptions. Omri inscription says that the deity Chemosh is sure angry because he wasn't getting the taxes he deserved. And then the Ahav is mentioned that he contributed so many fighting men and chariots in a military engagement. Now, as I mentioned in my lecture on Yonah, in Nineveh they found a tremendous archive of textual collection. That's the city to which Yonah is bidden to prophesy, in which a couple generations later Nahum prophesied against, and it was destroyed. Anyway, we're talking about 612 BCE for Yonah, roughly, is celebrated by the prophet Nahum, excavated by Austin in 1849. Tablets were grouped together in series, Iskaru, and subseries, Pirsu, arranged by numbers, indexed at the rims. Finding lists were also inscribed at the wall near the door. That's a librarian's paradise there. You have a classification system as early as Nineveh in the 7th century. Now, the Alexandrian library, there's a book called The Glory of the Hellenic World. I could talk for ages about Alexandrian library, but they had a lot of textual findings there. The Pincases by the head librarian Callimachus, roughly 305 to 240 BCE. It's a 120-volume catalog, and the Pincases are found on the walls of the halls, were lined with armaria, or lockers in which scrolls were deposited. Also a note, as somebody interested in classics, Longinus mentioned that he was in the Alexandrian library, and he found there a copy of the Septuagint in Greek, and he said that this was the most sublime text he ever written. The essay that this is mentioned is called the Perihoupsis in Greek, which means the sublime. Later philosophers like Kant would write on Das Erhabim. Kant argues that the sublime is like a raging sea and storm, and then he compares it to the beautiful, which is calm quietude and peacefulness that, reminds me of the Sturm und Drang movement of Goethe is like sublime. Wallace Stevens wrote many poems that have been classified in sublime tradition, such as The Snowman. But to go back to Kant, you might think of Beethoven's Appassionato Sonata as sublime, but the Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata as more in the area of the quietude and harmony of beauty and peace that comes through on that piece. So Longinus in Perihoupsis mentions that he found a copy of the Septuagint in the Alexandrian library, and he also mentions that in that library of the Alexandria there's a copy of Aristotle's Comedy. Now we know the work The Poetics, which is Aristotle's sort of scientific study, like an anatomy of the tragedy, that it has a structure, and there's a peripeteia, a turning point, and so forth. But as it may, Longinus says a lot about the Alexandrian library. If you're interested in that, see The Glory of the Hellenic World. Now, we're going to get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most important textual collection possibly in archaeological history, certainly for the 20th century. And what I'm going to say about this is focusing on the halachic aspects. This was the approach of my teacher, Rabbi Baumgarten, who looked at how the halacha of the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, compared to the halacha and emerging halachic traditions of the rabbis, the Pharisees, at the time that the Essenes were vibrant. So the first passage we're going to look at is from the Para Aduma, which we find in Bamidbar. We read, Zot hukat haTorah asher tziva Hashem lemor. Diber el bnei Yisrael veyiku alecha para aduma timima asher ein ba mum. Take upon yourself a red cow that is perfect and that does not have a blemish. Asher lo ala aleha o, that has never borne the yoke. Vinitatem ota el Elazar hakohen vehotzi ota el mechutz lamachaneh v'shachat ota lefanav. And give this cow, red cow, to Elazar the priest, and the cow shall be brought forth without the camp and shall be slain before Eliezer. Balakach Eliezer HaKohen midama be'etzba'o v'hizeh el nokach p'nei ohel moed b'dama sheva pa'amim. And Elazar the priest shall take their blood with his finger and sprinkle her blood toward the front of the tent of meeting 7 times. The saraf et ha-para, they're going to burn the cow, le'enav, in the eyes of Eliezer. Et ora ve'et basara, her skin and her flesh, ve'et dama, and her blood. Al parsha yisaraf, so they're burning the whole cow. And the priest shall take cedar wood. The lakacha kohen etz erez ve'ezov, ushnei tola'at, and hyssop and scarlet, and cast it into the midst of the burning of the heifer. El toch sarafat hakpara. V'kibetz begadav hakohen, he'll change his clothes. V'rachatz b'saro, he'll wash his flesh. B'mayim, in water. V'achar yavo el hamachaneh, then he will be able to come into the camp. V'tamei hakohen ad ha'arev. Now this is the key passage that the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, is going to debate with the Pharisees. The priest shall be unclean until the evening, literally until the ad ha'arev, until the evening. V'hasaraf otah v'kibes begadav b'mayim v'rachatz b'saro b'mayim v'tamei ad ha'arev. And he that burneth her, that is Eliezer the Kohen, shall wash his clothes in water and bathe his flesh in water. That's a repetition of what we learned earlier. And shall be unclean until the even. But every repetition has significance. V'asaf ish tahar et aper hapara v'henichach michutz l'machaneh b'makom tahor v'yetal la'adat b'nei Yisrael l'mishmeret l'mei nida chata'at hi. And a man that is clean shall gather up the ashes. Remember, the ashes of this red cow will purify you if you come into contact with the dead. And lay them up without the camp in a clean place, and it shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel for a water of sprinkling. It is a purification from sin. And he that guardeth the ashes of the heifer shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. This is another part that the Dead Sea Scrolls Essenes are going to debate with the Pharisees. Be unclean until the even. And it shall be unto the children of Israel and unto the stranger that sojourneth among them a chok olam, the hukat olam, a statute forever. That's pretty major. The kibes haosef et afer hapara et begadav v'tamei ad ha'arev v'yetal libnei Yisrael leger hager b'tocham, the hukat olam. So this is a statute forever. So this is pretty serious stuff. Now, we have a tractate in the Mishnah, the Kod Para, and that's very important. They're going to be discussing the kibes begadav hakohen, and we also have a reference to this in Leviticus 11. The Pharisees insisted that since the red cow was not a temple sacrifice, the tevel yom was considered adequately pure, just as he was eligible to consume non-sacramental purities. This is important, folks, because the Essenes are going to argue differently. They argue that they reject the tevel yom and that you must wait. See the Temple Scroll 11Q. They employ adult priests, not pirchei kahuna. So in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, they were using young adolescent kahuna, but the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't want to mess things up, so they used adult kohanim. See Temple Scroll and also 4Q, 394, etc. So the Essenes wrote, and concerning the purity of the cow, purgation, he who slaughters it, and he who burns it, and he who gathers its ashes, and he who sprinkles the purgation of water, all these must wait for Sunday to be pure, so that a pure man will sprinkle upon an impure one. It goes on. Let's look at the Mishnah in Para. It says, Lo hayita para rotza letzeit ein motzein ima shechora shelo amru shechora shechatu velo aduma shelo amru. Rabbi Yossi Omer lo mishum zeh shetayim shechatu ela mishum shenemar v'hotzi ota levada v'ziknei Yisrael hayu mikadamim b'ragalehem lahar hamishcha uveit tevila hayasham umitameim hayu et hakohen. They're actually defiling the priest so that he become impure. Hasoref et hapara mipenei hatzedukim shelo yehiu omrim b'marave shemesh hayita na'asit. So in this Mishnah Para 3:7 we learn they used to defile the priest who was to burn the cow because of the Zadokites, that they should not say that it must be made by those who had waited for sundown. So they assert the eligibility of Tevel Yom. This is a very important passage because the Essenes are in disagreement. And so you can learn Mishnaic law from these, from comparing the Essenes' views on these things. So let's read the fragment from Qumran 4Q 276. It says, garments with which he did not minister in the sacred precincts, and he shall gird the garments and slaughter of the cow before him, and he shall carry its blood in a clay vessel which was sanctified by the altar, and he shall sprinkle of its blood with his fingers 7 times toward the tent of meeting, and he shall cast the cedar wood and the hyssop. He shall sprinkle of its blood with his fingers 7 times toward the tent of meeting, and he shall cast the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet into the midst of its burning, and he shall gather the ashes of the cow, etc., etc. So there's a difference of opinion, folks, by the way the Essenes do the paroduma and the way the Pharisees, the rabbis, do it. Now, let's consider the phrase Tevel Yom, continued. We're looking at now an Essene fragment from 4Q 277, fragment 1. They go on. A man purified from any impurity which lasts till evening, the priest who purges with the blood of the cow, and all the clay vessels with which they purge the state of impurity. He shall bathe in water and be impure until the evening. One who touches the wetness of the purification water becomes impure. Let no man sprinkle the purification water upon those defiled by a corpse, except for a Kohen who is pure. Only he upon them, for he is performing the purgation rite for the impure. A child shall not sprinkle. Remember, in the Beit HaMikdash, they're having the Perchei Kohuna do it. Adolescents upon the impure. And those who receive the purification water shall first immerse themselves in water and be cleansed of the corpse defilement and of every other defilement. Then let the priest sprinkle the purification water upon them to purify them, for they cannot be sanctified unless they are cleansed of their flesh is clean. And anyone who touched by one who has a flux and his hands were not rinsed in water becomes unclean. And his bed and his seat touched his flux, the touch of his uncleanness, and he shall be impure until evening, and he who carries the garments shall bathe and be impure until evening. So they're showing you that they believe that even somebody who has impure garments that sits on a chair or whose garments are handled by somebody else will make that person impure. Now, let's consider this concept of the Nisik. The Nisik is a flow of water. This was the case of the red ashes and the ceremony of the Tekes of the Paraduma that were making people impure. But let's consider a Nisik. A Nisik is an unbroken stream of liquid that can defile. A. Impure liquids may contaminate not only other liquids and foods, but vessels. Impure liquids transmit first-degree uncleanliness to other liquids without any diminution through the chain of derivative contacts. So we have a Mishnah in Taharot, chapter 9 to 10, describes precautions taken, including quarantining to ensure the purity of workers in olive presses. Shammai is reputed to have threatened to extend restrictions applicable to impure wine, grapes, to olives as well when questioned by Hillel. In Makot 3, Mishnah Gimel through Hey, Yeshua ben Perchia said that wheat coming from Alexandria is unclean as a result of their water wheel. The sages said, if so, let them be unclean for Joshua ben Perchia, but pure for all of Israel. So Yeshua ben Perchia is not a really positive figure in the Mishnah or the Talmud, as you can find in 2 places, in 3 places actually, in Gittin and Sanhedrin. Anyway, let's go to the Essenes. What do they say about this Nisik? They say a stream defiles. That's in 4Q 274 and 4Q 284. To deal with the problem of juices exuding from ripened fruit and vegetables and their effect on the susceptibility to impurity. Harvested fruits are made susceptible to impurity by juices oozing regardless of the owner's intention. Thus, gatherers are required to be ritually clean. Rain and dew falling upon harvested fruits also make them susceptible. regardless of whether the precipitation was welcomed by the owner. Foods in an open earthen vessel in a home which is unclean becomes unclean. Even sealed vessels are not effective barriers against impurity for these very machmir Essenes. Now, let's go to immersion of the menorah. The Tosefta in Chagiga 3, it relates the Pharisees once immersed the menorah of the temple on a pilgrimage festival. The Sadducees ridiculed this purification. The Mishnah reads, it once happened that they immersed the menorah on a festival, and the Sadducees said, come to observe the Pharisees who immerse the light of the moon. Yerushalmi substitutes moon for orb of the sun. And so the menorah represents the sun and moon. Its 7 lights represent the 7 planets which serve the world, according to Suzuki. And Philo, in Quis Rerum Divinarum Heres, you find that in 225. But the point is, the Essenes have a different opinion. In one case, very atypical, they're less strict with this menorah in purification. It's an exceptional case for the Essenes, who are usually more machmir. At Qumran, liquids were held to be more potent transmitters of impurity than solids. The biblical principle that the ground and water attached to it were not subject to defilement seems to be followed by the Qumranites and Tanaim. According to Rabbi Eliezer, the copper and golden altars of the Beit HaMikdash did not require purifications after Hagim. That's in Mishnah Hagiga 3:8 from Exodus 20:21. Mizbach Adamah, which was also extended to metallic altars. Analogously, since the menorah was symbolic of the heavens, i.e. beyond the reach of man, may be deemed by the Sadducees to be immune to any contamination. However, the rabbis once opted to immerse the menorah as a precaution. So the rabbis were big time that we have to immerse the menorah because it is susceptible to tumah. But the Essenes and the Sadducees seem to hold similarly, if I'm correct, that the menorah, because its branches refer to the 7 planets, is beyond needing to be immersed to make it tahor. The rabbis hold it must be immersed. The Omer offering. This is very important, folks. The Omer, which I mentioned in my lecture on the environmental ethics, very important. But before we go there, the Mishnah in Tosefta Hagiga about the immersion of the menorah says, Maaseh behiv telu et ha-menorah b'yom tov v'ayu tzedukin omrim bo'u v'ra'u pershav shemetilin mo'or halavana. So they said, look at these rabbis who are immersing the orb of the moon. It goes on. Chama keneged chama ulevana shivat neroteha keneged zayin kochabim hamishamshim et ha'olam. So we're now going to skip, in the interest of time, to the Omer offering, and we're going to read Menachot 10:3. Keyetzad hayu osim. Then we're talking about how did they offer the Omer. Shulchei beit din yitzaim me'erev yom tov v'osim oto kiriyachut bimhuvar v'lekra ka kadei sheyeh noach lekatzor v'kol ha'yarot ha'semuchot l'sham mituchanesot l'shem kadei sheyeh nikzar be'osek gadol ki yavan shehasheshcha omer lahem ba hashemesh. So they're saying the sun is setting. Omrim hein ba hashemesh. Yes, the sun is setting. Omrim hein magalze, with this sickle. Omrim hein, yes, with this sickle. Magalzu. Omrim hein kufazu. Omrim hein kufazu. Omrim hein b'Shabbat omer lahem Shabbat zu. This is what the Essenes debate. Should you do it on this Shabbos? Omrim hayu hayin Shabbat zu. Omrim hayin exor. The hem omrim lo kitzor exor. The hem omrim lo kitzor shalosh pamim al kol davar v'davar. The hem omrim lo hayin hayin hayin. The kol kach lama. Mipnei hayibutusim shahayu omrim ein kitzorat haomer b'motzi'ei yom tov. So all of this ceremony was because of the Boethians who used to say the omer may not be reaped at the close of a festival day. Menachot 10:1. The Sadducees bring the Omer the day after Shabbat, i.e. Sunday. And this Rabbi Ishmael says the Omer brought on the Shabbos was taken from the 3 seahs, only a barley, and on weekday it was taken from only 5 seahs. But the sages say it is all one whether the second day of Passover were a Sabbath or a week. The 10th of an ephah of flour was produced from these 3 seahs of barley. Rabbi Chanina, the prefect of the Kohanim, says, on a Sabbath it was reaped by 1 man, and with 1 sickle and 1 basket, and on a weekday it was reaped by 3 men. So the Essenes have a difference of opinion of whether you could reap the Omer on Shabbos. The Omer was on Sunday for the Essenes, who would harvest the Omer only on Sunday after Pesach. In Cave 4, a scroll fragment was found where the Essenes denounced the practice of waving the Omer on Shabbos as, quote, an error of blindness. The text reads, waving of Omer, mistake of blindness, to'ut ivarum, accept your Sabbaths. In the Masada text of the Essenes, the concept of forbidden grain, or chadash, is made, from Leviticus 23:14. You get the idea. The rabbis have a different idea of when you can reap the Omer, and that it really won't interfere, that we have to wait till Sunday, if I'm not mistaken. So we see the Essenes polemicizing against the rabbis as, quote, an error of blindness. That's rather harsh. Now let's get to oils. Oils are very important, folks. The Essenes did not use any oils. Remember, in the Greek Hellenistic time, the Greeks would bathe, essentially, by putting perfumed oils on their skin, and with a scraper would scrape off the oils. But the Essenes avoided them. They wouldn't eat salad dressing, neither. So in rabbinic law, defilement, tima'ah, is sometimes related to gal or staining. You find that in Avodah Zarah, Galei Avdei Kochavim, in Mishnah Torah 9:1-3. In the olive presses operated by the Am Haratzim, people who did not observe ritual purity and not trusted with giving proper meiser and truma, demai or doubtful produce became because the tithes were not taken. Special procedures were followed, noted when we read. I'll read it in English. If one locked in the olive traders inside the olive press building, and there were articles there within unclean with treading contact uncleanness, Rabbi Meir says the olive press building becomes unclean. Rabbi Yehudah says the olive press building remains clean. Rabbi Simon says, if in the opinion of the Amayaratzim, laborers' articles were clean, the olive press building becomes unclean. But if, to their way of thinking, they were clean, the olive press building remains clean. Rabbi Yossi said, but the reason why all the objects within become unclean is only because the Am Haratzim are not conversant with the laws regarding the moving of aught of trying to remain pure. Now the Essenes, they hold all wood, stones, and dust, which are sullied by the defilement of oils, having stains of oil on them, according to their defilement, shall he who touches them become defiled. So they're more machmir, folks. They're more machmir with the halacha of how oil can defile. So I should mention that defilement, timat, is something that both the Essenes and the rabbis tried to avoid. Because purity is important to both the Essenes and the rabbis. I just want to say some general principles about purity. We have a Mishnah. If the workmen in the olive press building went in and came out, and there was unclean liquid in the olive press building lying on the floor, and there was enough space between the unclean liquid and the olives to wipe the bare feet dry on the ground, then they remain clean. If uncleanness be found in front of the olive press building, workmen and the grape cutters, they are believed when they say, we did not touch the uncleanness. And likewise also the children among them go outside an entrance of the olive press building and relieve themselves behind the fence to be considered clean to re-enter. How far may they go and still be accounted clean? Just as far as they can be seen. So this is in Chagiga 2, Mishnah 7, Zion, in ascending order. The Perushim are those who kept apart from the Amharatzim and ate their ordinary food, chulin, impurity. The Oklei Teruma are the Kohanim and the households of Leviim who ate their heave offerings. 3. The Kodesh are those permitted to eat of the sacrifices, and the Chata'at are those involved in the preparation of the ashes of the Para Adumah. According to one opinion in the Talmud, the 5th category of purity for tithes is to be inserted between 1 and 2 of Mishnah Hagiga 2:6. Contact with persons of a lower grade of purity, or even their garments, was considered defiling, according to the Mishnah Hagiga 2:7. So I could cite to you fragment after fragment of Dead Sea Scroll texts where they are hypersensitive to the laws of purities. For instance, in the War Scroll, it says, in the context of a regulation to safeguard the purity of priests on the battlefield, when we read, "And when the slain are falling, the priests shall sound their trumpets. From a distance they shall not go into the midst of the slain, lest they be stained by their impure blood. Lehit ga'el badam timuatam." The reason given for the priestly rule is found when we read, "Ki kadoshim hema velo yichalu shemen mishichat kahunatam bedam goy hevel." For they, the priests, are holy, and they are not to defile the oil of their priestly anointment with the blood of vain nations. So I have more examples of the Dead Sea Scroll sect's strictness, machmir on purities. But I'm just going to sum it up now in the light of time about some differences between the Perushim, Sadukim, and Essenes. So the Perushim, a well-known debate between the rabbis and the Sadukim, the Sadducees, who were Hellenized, wealthy priests. The Perushim would light the incense after entering the Kodesh Kodashim on Yom Kippur. The Sadukim held light the incense before entering the Kodesh Kodashim. The Kohen Gadol should on Yom Kippur, she might see Hashem and die. Well, the Essenes boycotted the Beit HaMikdash and founded this commune out there in the Qumran near En Gedi, the Essenes. Bahala, the Pharisees separate in every batch, and the Essenes separate in every kneading of each individual halot. They're more machmir. The Pharisees wait till 3 stars mark the end of Shabbos. The Essenes would carry out Shabbos longer, like Hasidim, and wait longer. The Sabbath of the Tehum, 2,000 cubits, that you can't travel outside 2,000 cubits. The rabbis say 2,000. The Essenes made it 1,000. They were more machmir. In Gittin, it says you shall not write the name of the ruler. Well, the Essenes, it doesn't apply because 85% of them, Josephus says, never got married. The bones, and the only reason they got married was to have children. The bones of animals do not defile according to rabbinic law. That is, you can enjoy a wonderful chicken dinner. You know, you go to the gourmet glatt and you get the, what is it called? Chicken special. And it has bones. And that's permissible according to Yedayim 4:6. But the Essenes, they would not do such a thing. The bones defile. Qumran burial of bone remnants have been found in jars from meals that may have been for the purpose of preventing their defilement by dogs and other animals while they still had remnants of meat. The Essenes held dogs are unclean. The Essene texts support the hypothesis. This rule assigned the 4th year fruit to priests to the land of Israel, as in Leviticus 19:23, while 4Q 266 extends it also to the land of sojourning. So we could go on and on and on about the differences between Sadukim, Perushim, and the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scroll sect. But for those who want more detail and more depth, I refer you to my paper that I gave in Cleveland at the AJL and is in the Cleveland AJL proceedings. The Dead Sea Scrolls is an immense area, and the approach of my teacher, Rabbi Baumgarten, was to look at the halachic aspects of the Essenes, the Dead Sea Scroll sect, and compare them with the Pharisees and the evolving normative halachic traditions in Judaism throughout the millennia. Thank you so much. I appreciate the chance to offer this year.